Okay, welcome back, everybody. We're on to week 6, and this week we're going to talk about privacy laws. And there are many, and they are relatively new. What I want you to take away from this week is an idea about your own privacy, your own data privacy, how you protect yourself, and also and how the laws apply to you. And then also we'll look at privacy from a security manager's perspective. So we'll really look at it from two different ways this week. Number one is more around data privacy, but physical security managers, organizational security managers have a huge remit in that space. And then we'll look at employee privacy and what expectations of privacy an employee might have in the workplace. So when we talk about privacy laws, again, the prevailing um, logic of the day, if you will, is to talk about privacy and data, and that's okay because again, the organizational security manager has a big dog in that fight. But generally, privacy laws are enacted today to protect data, and you have to consider data. Most people will say, okay, data, so that's the stuff on my cell phone and on my computer, but it's also things in file cabinets and in your wallet. Just about anywhere there is data of some kind, right? I mean, let's take a broader view of what we consider to be data when we have this conversation. Let's not just think of, data as in the stuff on our computer. Let's think about all the things we write down, all of the pieces of information we have perhaps in our wallet or in our dorm room or in our apartment. There's a lot of data, a lot of information that floats around. And every major privacy law that we'll talk about has some kind of physical component. It isn't just a cybersecurity threat. There are regulations that say how data needs to be physically protected and places where data may be simply on a server, right? Where it's all bits and bytes. Those also have to be physically protected, and every major privacy law has some form of physical component to it. Um, you're going to find, especially the first one we're going to talk about, GDPR this week. You're going to see that the penalties are really high. I mean, protection of privacy has become such a huge thing that some of the penalties are just phenomenal. You will not see higher fines for any type of violation, I think, of any kind of business law, bigger than those for not protecting people's privacy. And the big takeaway is that this, just like every part of law, but this more than almost any, is a changing landscape. Privacy laws change almost daily in some way through some court decision, through some new regulation. It is a constantly changing landscape. Those who are cybersecurity majors know this or should know this, but it's just as important for organizational security majors to have a way to understand how privacy laws may be changing and how their responsibilities in protecting data may change. So many privacy laws and protection of data laws revolve around personally identifiable information, or PII. You will hear that term when you hit the workplace quite often. And really, PII is any information that can be used to distinguish or trace an individual's identity. So your name is personally identifiable information. Your social security number, date, place of birth, mother's maiden name, biometric records like your fingerprints and an iris scan if you have that done for some reason. Um, it can be information that's linked or linkable to an individual, medical records, educational records, financial, you apply for a credit card, that all contains PII. All of that stuff is personally identifiable information. Now you say, okay, my name is PII, therefore I must protect everybody's name. You have to remember PII is almost like a game of Jenga. You start to stack the blocks on top of each other and it gets more dangerous. And that's kind of the way I want you to think about it. PII is like Jenga. You start to stack the blocks up, the name. The name by itself, I mean, heck, we walk around with name tags on. We walk around with ID badges on. Someone says, hi, I'm Bob. You say, hi, I'm Brian, and you give them your name. I mean, we give it freely, right? It's how we identify one person from the next. But once you put that name with other information, it starts to build a dossier, if you will, of that person and who they are, and it contains a lot of personally identifiable information when you start to stack those Jenga blocks up. So think of PII as protecting the individual blocks so that no one can reconstruct them and get that tower built so high that it crumbles upon you. Let's look at 2 slides of examples of PII and think about how if you have each one of these things, you could actually become the other person, at least on paper. Apply for credit cards, apply for immigration papers, apply for a mortgage and loans. Most of this is financially driven right now, but some of it can be terrorism driven. You want to become another person. Some of it could be, simply you need a new identity. But if you have, look, the name, maiden name, mother's maiden name, how many applications ask for mother's maiden name or ask for mother's maiden name? You'll see it on, when you have to give security questions, when you have a password that's, changeable, right? They ask for your security questions. You'll often see on there. Now, most of you probably don't use that when you use other things, but it's certainly a question that is asked that helps identify a person. Of course, we have personal identification numbers like Social Security, passport number, driver's license number, if you have a taxpayer identification number, if you have a business, patient identification numbers, including your number off of your medical insurance card, perhaps. And then, of course, your bank account numbers, your credit card numbers. Your personal address information, right? Your street address, your email address. Once you start stacking these things together, think about how you could become that other person, right? Personal telephone numbers. I mean, those are things that are pretty quickly shared between people. In fact, you probably post them somewhere. But that's PII. Let's look at a couple more examples. Personal characteristics like photo of yourself, right? Fingerprints, your handwriting. We collect those in physical security all the time. We collect ID photos all the time. And we may ask somebody for fingerprints for one type of clearance or another. And we may ask them to sign their name. And I've seen so many ID badges with a person's signature on it. I have no idea why it's there. I mean, if you've seen my signature, you know that anybody with, a pen could probably do my signature because it's so sloppy. But people put them on badges. So biometric data, obviously, retina scans, voice signatures, facial geometry, facial recognition files, anything like that could certainly be used to create the identity of someone else. The VIN number or title number of your car. Think about it. If we have the VIN number, then we can figure out who that belongs to. Now I can potentially insure that car. Once I have insurance on the car, I've paid for that, right? I have the VIN number, I have your driver's license number, and I have your name. I can get online insurance that way. Once I have online insurance, I can take that insurance card, the VIN number, all that information and say, look, I lost my driver's license. There's lots of ways for you to become another person using PII. And then asset information, your IP address, your MAC address, things like that, that link to a particular person are certainly used to identify a person. And we'll see examples of that on the internet all the time. You wonder why and a ad comes up that just happens to be related to something you just searched on the internet. Well, guess what? It's because they used your IP address to sort of identify you, or at least identify that machine and where it's been and what you've looked at. And if you don't think that you've filled out some online forms with your name and your phone number to get information from somebody, or to sign up for an account with Facebook or someone else, all that information is stored. They know who you are, and now they know what you're looking at. Don't mean to make you paranoid, but if you've never really thought about the fact that all ads are targeted to you and thought that was kind of odd, it's all about the collection of data. But we've been talking about collection of data from a computer, right? These are all things you pretty much put into a computer somewhere. But let's think about the physical angle to this information. Your name and your mother's maiden name and any aliases, any previous names you used, you put that on your work application. When you applied for a job, it went on the application. And when you applied for a background check to get that job, potentially, if your company does background checks, which most do and should, you were asked questions like, where were you born? And, mother's maiden name, other names you may have used if you happen to be married or you changed your name. Personal identification numbers, your social security number. Again, when you went to work for a company, you filled out certain paperwork like an I-9 form. It's your immigration form to show that you are legal to work in the United States and don't require sponsorship as a foreign national. When you filled that out, you had to provide 2 different forms of ID. And they had to be 2 specific types, a social security number and a passport, or a driver's license and a passport, or a driver's license and a social security card. Or, there's a combination of things you can provide, but both of them have to be independent of each other. It's to really prove your identity for immigration purposes, and you've provided those, and your company has photocopied those. They've either taken the numbers down or photocopied, and most of them will photocopy, and attached it to the I-9 that they keep on file. And that stays for a very long time, and your driver's license number does not normally change. right? Very rarely does a driver's license number change. So therefore, companies you've worked for in the past likely have a file with your driver's license in it that someone can access, a paper file. Passport number, I have to give my passport number every time I take an international flight, not just to the airline, by the way, who puts it into their file. And on my frequent flyer, I have, stupidly provided my passport number because it's just easier. When I go to check in for a flight, I go normally to the airline lounge and before an international flight, and I give them my passport and they check in and they say, Brian, okay, everything's good to go. And when I get to the gate, I don't normally need to go through and have my passport rechecked other than just to show it when I board the plane. But the airlines have my passport number, certainly. Driver's license number, same way. Patient identification number. If I've used, my dentist has my patient identification number, which will go back to all my personal information. All of those are kept normally in some form of paper record before they ever get archived. Now think about things like your personal address, okay, your street address and your email address. It could very well, some of you work in retail. Go look at the schedule or go look at the roster. A lot of times there'll be a posting with a roster with your name and your telephone number and your email address right on it, posted in the break room or in the common area of your employer. It is so common to post those things. It is considered personally identifiable information because when you start to stack these things, you could become that person. So these are all physical things. But look, there's even more. The pictures and the fingerprints or the handwriting sample. ID photos. The physical security manager holds those, right? They're in a system normally because they're normally taken electronically, right? We don't normally take pictures with a Polaroid and cut them out and put them on an ID badge, although there are still many places that do that. But you still have possession of ID photos. Security records also contain biometric data if you're using any kind of electronic access control. The VIN number on a car, a title number. If I watch you get out of your car on campus, I can walk over and I can get the plate number off the back of your car. And depending on the age of your car, I can look on the dashboard. And if you haven't put, a bunch of other crap up on the dashboard, I can see the VIN number. It's on a little metal plate on the dashboard. Or I can climb underneath and it's stamped on the engine in about 10 different places, I believe. But I can get the VIN number off just about any car. With that information, is there a potential that I could take that to motor vehicles and get that car re-registered? Sure. If I have other information on you, right? I now know your name. I know your email address because you go to SRU, so I can find that in the directory, right? There's a lot of things I can put together. And then, finally, the asset information. We give out our IP address all the time when we're online. It's constantly going to someone. And we also give it out to help desks and others. I can't tell you how many times I call the help desk. I'm one of those guys who, is a frequent flyer on the help desk at Pfizer, and I call and they say, okay, can you give us your IP address? Absolutely. And I give it to them. This is an outside service. I'm assuming that they protect my information and they protect that IP address. But they could certainly plant things into my computer, all kinds of spyware using that, and I probably wouldn't see it. So, the physical angle of protecting data is still there. Most of this information is taken down in hard copy somewhere and held onto in hard copy somewhere. It's transferred electronically, right? It's put into a system, but somewhere those records still exist. And there's where the physical security, the organizational security manager steps in when it comes to privacy laws. So what's the real bad part? There's no comprehensive data privacy law. It's really a hodgepodge of things, and we're going to talk about several, one international and several U.S.-based laws, one that may become the law of the land at some point. It seems to be going that direction, which is why I'm going to discuss it. But the privacy laws are not all codified in one place. They're one's for health information, one's for financial information, online information, all kinds of different information is stored in all kinds of different laws, and therefore it's very hard to keep up with. It's very complex, and you're responsible for keeping up with it. Specific to a corporate security manager, you may hold data in access control systems, right? Card access systems, right? Your reader system, video surveillance systems. Make no mistake, your video, if you're retaining video, which almost everybody does for a certain period of time, contains personally identifiable information. You've got pictures of people's faces. You've got that tied sometimes to your access control system. So now I know that Brian ran his badge on building A, and then there's a picture at the exact same time of Brian coming through the door. I now have Brian's image and his name and any other information I collected as part of my access control registration. Investigative reports contain huge amounts of PII normally, and that is something that you've got to definitely protect. Background checks, obviously, right? Contains normally account numbers, normally some form of at least part of a social security number is in a background check. You can take data from previous arrests, trace somebody back. If I have a background check and it shows that I was convicted of a crime in the state of Michigan, there's an online offender registry that I can go and look at, and I can pull up a picture. I can pull up even information on tattoos and distinguishing marks that that offender had at the time of their incarceration. So a background check can be used to help you build a dossier on just about anybody. Voluntary disclosures. So oftentimes an employee will come to you and say, it's normally a case of divorce. When this happens, they will say that, I have a restraining order against my soon-to-be ex-spouse. They may not come within 500 feet of my place of employment or call me at the place of employment. And it is a good practice to collect that, right, to ask them for a copy and keep it, because oftentimes when police show up, when something does go wrong, they find that these have not been registered properly or not been timely registered with court clerks, and the police then have no reference point. When you give them that copy, they at least say, okay, we know that something's here, right? And then they can call the court and get verification. But those generally have an amazing amount of information, because you're giving up addresses and places that you may go that you're asking the court to forbid somebody else from going. And then clearance certifications. I mean, if you have a government clearance that you have to you have to process for someone. I don't personally do them, but my team does clearances for chemical facility anti-terrorism standards. That registration contains tons of information. And oftentimes, it's asking questions about sometimes, those types of infrastructure clearances, even asking about, your neighbors, give us names of references. So now you're turning over other people's PII, right? So, the corporate security manager holds a lot of private data in either electronic or oftentimes in hard copy form. And let's go into a little bit about what happens when you don't protect that. So I have a list here, and these are the ones that I believe affect security people the most, but there are certainly more. There are a lot of privacy laws, especially in the US, because again, we don't have that overarching, right? That adding to complexity slide. We don't have that overarching privacy law in the US. But in Europe, they kind of do. And that's the GDPR, the Global Data Protection Requirements. We'll talk a little bit about that, and never fear, because the Europeans have put a nice spin on this, which really affects international businesses. And even if your business is almost only in the US, if you have any employees that are European citizens, their data can be protected and you have to abide by it. And I'll show you why you really want to do that. We're going to talk about the Fair Credit Reporting Act in so much as it applies to security. We're going to play a little game of follow the bouncing ball. And it's a theory that I have on the FCRA and how it impacts third-party investigators. And I'd be interested to know if any of you, once you hear my explanation, agree with my theory. And I will tell you that I have brought this to several people in the security space, and some say, yes, you're absolutely right. Holy crap, that's a big thing. And others say, oh, no, it's nothing to worry about. We do this all the time, which always scares me. We're going to talk about the Health Insurance Protection and Accountability Act, and that protects health information, and it is really a misunderstood act when it comes to employers, so we'll go over that a little bit. And then finally, we'll talk about the California Privacy Rights Act, which is a new extension on the California privacy laws that took effect a few years ago. But I think we should talk about it because it appears to be that that is the model that's going to be emulated if we ever do get to a federal privacy law in the U.S. It is likely to be some offshoot of that California law, which really is starting to gain traction in other places. So the global data protection requirements apply in the European Union and the European Economic Area, but also apply to data transferred outside of those areas, which is really why if you work for an American company, if you stay working in the U.S., which most people will, if you're a U.S. citizen, it still applies to you. The basic principles of GDPR are lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. In other words, what's this data being used for? A purpose limitation. If you tell me the data is used for this purpose, the data that I'm giving you, the information that I'm giving you, my privacy information, you say you're going to use it for something, then that is what it should be used for. It's built around data minimization. You can't collect and store more data than you need to meet that original purpose limitation, right? If the purpose of the data is for me to provide you with uniforms, let's just say, right, for work. I ask for your shoe size and your shirt size and your pant size. And then I start asking you other questions about, well, how much do you weigh and how tall are you? If I already have your sizes, I don't need that other information, right? So I'd be limited on what I can ask about your personal characteristics, right? I can't ask your eye color if the purpose is to collect information about your uniform size. So I need to minimize the data that I request to the actual purpose that I've determined is that I have shared with you. The data needs to be accurate. You have a right as a European citizen to challenge data and to make sure it's accurate. The storage limitation is a storage limitation on time. How long do you need this data for, right? If the data is to make a certain decision, then once the decision is made, do you still need the data? This is important in things like credit cards. You're asking me for my employer's name and how long I've been there. You use that to make a determination as to whether you think you're going to give me a credit card, which to me, credit history is probably all they really need. But once you've asked that question, how long I've been there, do you need to store that anywhere? Why would you need to store the name of my employer if you've already made the decision to give me credit based on that information that you took into account up front? So there's limitations on the time, and we'll talk about retention schedules a little bit later. Integrity and confidentiality, that's around the security of the data. Normally that security is related to security of the electronic records, but also of the printed records. If I fill out that application for a credit card and I don't do it online, I do it on a paper form. I mean, I don't know how many of you have traveled internationally, but when you get on European airlines, especially the discount ones, they're constantly walking up and down the aisles trying to get you to apply for credit cards, buy toys for your kids, buy perfume, all kinds of stuff. It's almost like you're a captive audience for sales. And people fill those things out all the time, which because they fill them out and they give them, 25,000 air miles for nothing in exchange for that information. But now those must be secured in a certain way, especially in the European Union. And then accountability, that's the audit right, the right for the government and individuals to audit these companies to make sure they're doing things right. So those are the 7 principles around GDPR, and they really do make sense, right? I mean, you have to be transparent about the fact you're collecting. You have to do it in a fair way. You have to limit the purpose. The data has to kind of match what your purpose is that you've stated. You have to collect the minimum amount of data, and you have to make sure it's accurate. You have storage limitations with time. You only need to hold on to my data for as long as you need to make a decision, and then you shouldn't store it any longer. You are responsible for protecting it so that others don't get to it, and I have the right to go and make sure that you're doing that. So this doesn't sound too hard, really. I mean, those sound like practical things. But you have to remember that this information gets transferred out of the EU, out of the EEA locations, right? It goes from France to the US for a company that may be US based, but has a, sales force in France. Now that data is still protected under GDPR. One of the big things that trips up security managers when it comes to GDPR is the right to be forgotten. That means that I have a right as a European citizen, if I'm covered by GDPR, to be forgotten, to have my data erased. This applies to things like visitor systems. If I'm a visitor from France and I come to an American company and you register me as a visitor and you give me a visitor pass and you have a visitor system, right, a logbook, whatever you might have, where you take down my name and the reason for my visit, the time that I came in and all those things. Unless there's a regulatory reason why you must have that record. There are some places where they're government contractors and they require you to keep records for a certain amount of time. But in most cases, that's not the case. As a European citizen, I can make a request to you to be forgotten. I would like all of my data erased, please. Thank you. And that's pretty much all it takes. Unless there is some reason, which I must then share with you what the reason is. I cannot do that because U.S. law requires that I keep a record of visitors because we are a government contractor. I cannot do that because, we produce items that are known to the state of California to potentially cause cancer, and therefore we must keep your information as a visitor to show you've been here and potentially exposed. Those are the types of things that you can share back, if indeed they're true. But in most cases, it's the right to be forgotten. I will tell you the right to be forgotten, interesting thing, at least for now, is it does not apply to video. So when you came in as a visitor and you walked past my security camera when you walked in the door, you can't say, I want you to erase me. And the reason that is that way is because it became impractical, because to erase a single person out of a video clip is nearly impossible without a great deal of equipment and expertise to block someone out of a retained video. Once it's retained, and you would have to then block out people who haven't made that request and you may want to keep records on. So it doesn't apply to video, but it certainly applies to all other types of records. The fines for GDPR are enormous. This is the thing that got everybody shook up when GDPR became law in the last, say, 5 years. And that is that the fines for a lesser offense is 10 million euro, right? Or 2% of worldwide revenue from the previous year. Notice it says worldwide revenue, not just revenue within the EU. So, if you're that same company and in the US you make $100 million and you only make $2 million in France, but $2 million is still good money, right? So you still have your couple of guys in France, right, that are selling your product. The 2% would be based on $102 million in revenue, not just the 2% made in Europe. On major offenses in GDPR, where you have major breaches, where you have major faux pas, if you will, in collecting information or not erasing people, and you've made a pattern of it, the fine can be 2 million euro for a major offense or 4% of worldwide revenue. So I took the example of Ford Motor Company in 2019, the last reported year for revenue as of the making of this video. Because there's a lag in reporting, and 2020 was kind of a weird year anyway for all kinds of revenue. But Ford, in a major offense, would pay either 20 million euro or 5 billion euro, depending on whether they went with the dollar amount or the percentage. And it's always whichever is greater. So on a major GDPR violation, Ford Motor Company would pay a $6 billion fine to the European Union. That is, now we're talking real money, right? So adherence to GDPR is so important to companies, especially those with any type of international arm, but you really don't have to have an international arm because you could have visitors or a single employee that happens to be European or a European citizen who works in the US and is covered by GDPR because their information, their passport information is European information. So you can't run afoul of GDPR. I would strongly suggest that when you get that first job as a security manager, you find out who your GDPR steward is. Most companies have them, and you make friends really quick and go through with them and ask them to evaluate all of the information that you collect. And if you decide to collect new information for some new program, if you're going to collect, all of a sudden you're going to start using retina scanners to let people in buildings, then get with them and make sure that they evaluate how you collect, how you store, how you protect, and how you forget that information if it's requested. It will save you a lot of heartache. It will certainly save you your job and could save your company, depending on the size of the company, billions of dollars. So now I want you to follow the bouncing ball with me on the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and I ask you to humor me for just a few minutes on this because you're going to help me prove or disprove a theory. At least I'll get your opinion, hopefully. A Fair Credit Reporting Act really talks about consumer reports, investigative consumer reports. you normally would use them as a credit check, right? You apply for a credit card, you apply for an apartment, right? They run a credit check on you to see if you've, stiffed the last landlord, right? An investigative consumer report means a credit report or portion thereof in which information on a consumer's character, general reputation, personal characteristics, or mode of living is obtained through personal interviews with neighbors, friends, associates, or with whom other people that are acquainted or may have knowledge concerning any such information. So it could be a credit bureau, right? They would have knowledge of your financial mode of living, right? They would know how you spend your money. It could be your employer, previous employer. How much do you make versus how much credit will extend to you? But it could be interviews with neighbors, friends. The investigative consumer report definition is really, really broad. And that's where this comes into play. We talk about fair credit reporting because normally these types of investigations, if you will, have something to do with money, either lending of money or hiring of someone. Running that financial background on somebody to see if they are of good character for you to either extend credit or to have handling your money as an employer. And that's the broadness of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. This term, investigative consumer report, is so broad, and that's where we can run into some trouble. So let's pull this thing apart in pieces and see where we end up as a physical security or an organizational security manager. So I pulled out relevant parts of the FCRA. And in general, a consumer report means any written, oral, or other communication. So it doesn't need to be written down. It can be oral communication, or it could be written down. Any type of communication by a consumer reporting agency, and it bears on a consumer, and it talks about their character, their reputation, personal characteristics, mode of living, any factor, right? And if you go down to the next part of the act, it includes in employment purposes. So any conversation I have with a third party concerning your employment could be considered covered by the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So let's take this another step. So in the exclusions, it says, except as provided in paragraph 3, blah, 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 which I did not include here because it wasn't relevant to this conversation. Consumer report does not include, if you jump down to the yellow, communications or other information among persons related by common ownership or affiliated by corporate control. If it is clearly and conspicuously disclosed to the consumer that the information may be communicated among such persons as the consumer is given opportunity. So when you first go to work for an employer, right, it is pretty common in your employment packet, all those forms you sign, that they basically say that they will collect some data on you. And you understand that you and the company have a corporate relationship with each other. I can communicate information internally in the company to other employees of the company, like human resources, if indeed I find in an investigation that you have, let's say, been convicted of a crime in the past, right? That's your character I'm talking about. And I can talk internal in the company about that to HR to say, did you know that Brian got arrested for his third DUI and just got convicted of it? And now we may have a problem with him when he travels on business. He's going to rent a car on our behalf. What are we going to do? Those conversations don't violate the Fair Credit Reporting Act stipulation that you need to be aware of that conversation because you've already had a company and a corporate relationship with your employer. Let's take that one step farther. Part of the Fair Credit Reporting Act it talks about adverse actions that might be taken, right? You could deny somebody's credit, right? If they applied for a credit card and you went through that investigation, found out that they, have not paid their bills regularly for some time and have really no history of ever doing it, that adverse action may be denying them credit or charging them a higher interest rate, right? An increased charge, as it says here in Section 1B1 there. However, under B2, it also includes a denial of employment or any other decision for employment purposes that adversely affects any current or prospective employee. So therefore, when we had that conversation, I, as the internal investigator, right, an employee of the company, had that conversation with HR, which I'm allowed to have because there's a contractual relationship between you and the company, right, a corporate relationship. We have that conversation, and we decide that we are going to now terminate Brian because Brian has his third DUI. Brian travels quite frequently on company business. He needs to rent a car in order to get his job done, and he can no longer rent cars because he doesn't have a driver's license. We're not going to make an accommodation to hire him a driver. Therefore, Brian, we're going to terminate your employment because you're really not employable by us. And we got this information through a consumer report, which is covered under the background checks, right? Your conviction history would be part of that character check, and therefore we've terminated you. Everything sounds great. But what if? What if I hired a third-party investigator or a third-party company to do that background check, or to give me information on employees that had that Brian's information about that third DUI, right? The third-party investigator is disclosing it to me, and I'm disclosing it to HR, but it's information about Brian. Brian has no corporate or contractual relationship with that third-party vendor. The decisions that are made based on that transfer of information may affect my employment. And in fact, in the example I gave, they were going to fire me because I can't drive a car, right? So the actions of that third party caused an adverse action under Fair Credit Reporting for Brian. Brian has no corporate or contractual relationship with that third party. They provided the information. So what does this mean? Well, under Fair Credit Reporting Act, one of the questions that you asked was the consumer, which in this case is Brian, the employee, given the opportunity before the time the information is initially communicated to direct that such information not be communicated among such persons. Did the third-party investigator call me first to let me verify that information was accurate? Did they call me first to ask if I wanted it released? Now, some of this information is in open sources, right? Some states have open access to convictions. And if it's open source, then in most cases, a court would never find that anything was violated because the company could have done it themselves. They just took an expeditious means to do so through a third party. It was just easier. We needed the manpower to do it, and that's what we did. But if it's not open source information, are we not violating the FCRA when we send a third-party investigator to do something for us and bring us back information that may not be public information? So if you're a company that's doing background checks and you do a very thorough background check, including interviews with previous employers, interviews with neighbors and friends and references, does that third party not first need to go to the person who is affected, to the consumer, right? The person that we're talking about here, to give them the opportunity to verify or to correct or to challenge any information? My feeling is yes. I have talked to a number of private investigators who say, no, that can't be right. And I think they say that because that would be a big chunk of business that they would lose. But I honestly believe, and I would really appreciate everybody's opinion on this, does the fact that a third-party investigator who has no relationship with you at all, providing information to your employer at their request, have the obligation to come to you first to ask you if this information is correct or not correct? And there are a number of people who I have spoken with who have said it appears that that is the case. And I will tell you that I have never found a private investigator who's ever done that. But I'd be interested in your take on it. But that's just one application of looking at the law and making a business decision as to what's best for you. I don't use third-party investigators for anything that is not open source. I just use it because it's easier for me to hire somebody to do it than do it myself. In some cases, I'm just too busy. But I don't have them go out and actually do interviews with people, and certainly not do interviews with people who we don't have a contractual or a corporate relationship with other than our own employees, because I believe that they need to share that first with the person being investigated to make sure that what they heard was accurate. And that would probably blow an investigation, right? It would blow the fact the investigation was even going on in some cases. So again, I'd be interested to hear your take on it if you so desire to share, but it's just one way that we apply the law into our own practice. So let's just jump ahead real quick and talk about a couple more. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, okay? The HIPAA rule. The privacy rule, it's a federal law. It gives you rights over your health information. It sets rules and limits on who can look at and receive your health information. There are two different sections. There's the privacy rule, And that applies to all forms of individual protected information, electronic, written, or oral. And there's the security rule, which requires security for health information only in electronic form. We concern ourselves as an organizational security person with the privacy rule, because health information, you have to understand, in almost all cases, starts with the scribblings of a doctor. And those are things that are transcribed then into your record. Now, many of the tests you take in a hospital and those types of things, genetic tests, all those things, are almost electronic from jump, right? Many times the heart rate monitor is connected to the computer, which then puts it into your record and it records your heart rate, right? I'm not a medical professional, so I'll use that simple idea. But much of your health information starts off in a written form, and those records are certainly protected under the privacy rules because they're not just electronic, they are written and they're oral. So it's conversations with your doctors as well. One of the things that people don't understand, however, is that, they believe that anytime an employer has anything about their health, that they can't share that internally. It does not protect your employment records, even if that employment record has health-related information in it, right? In most cases, that privacy rule, according to HHS, doesn't apply to the employer. I say that, and so I think about things like now when you go into work, you may have your temperature taken. And if you have a fever, that could go into an employment record of some kind, right? That you were, put on administrative leave for 10 days because you came into work with a fever and you may have been exposed to COVID, right? That can go in your employment record because people like security need to know that so they can shut off your access to the facility. People like HR and payroll need to know that because most companies are compelled to pay people while they're on that quarantine. So health information like that can go into an employment record, and it's not protected under the Health Insurance, Portability, and Accountability Act. And I'm going to correct that as we go here. See what happens when you type fast. But you really need to be cautious, right? So health information like a doctor's note. If you've been absent from the workplace for 3 days, it is very common for employers to say you need to bring a doctor's note after 3 days. I don't know what the magic of 3 days is, but that seems to be the rule of thumb. Employers sometimes go overboard, and if you are an employer, and when you are an employer, and you will be, and a manager, and each of you will be at some point in your career for sure, you can ask for a doctor's note if that is your company policy. What you can't ask for is the diagnosis. So if I bring a doctor's note that says, yes, Brian was under my care for the 3 days where he was not present in the workplace, signed Dr. Smith, I can't say, well, what was wrong with you? Unless it's something that is particularly covered by the actual employment, right? If you are a healthcare provider, if you're a nurse, they may be able to ask that question to cut down on contagion, right? But if it's not at all related to the job, if you are a store clerk, you can't say, well, why were you out? I know you were out. I know the doctor said it's okay, but why were you out? That would indeed potentially violate HIPAA because you're discussing the health information that is covered under privacy. Without your permission, the employer cannot go directly to the healthcare provider either, right? Unless it has to do with insurance coverage, if the company is self-insured, your employer can't call your doctor and say, hey, I got your note here for Brian, says he was under your care for 3 days. What was wrong with him? Because I need to put that in my record. Now, anything that I share is open for me to share about if I say, well, yeah, I had a cold. Then, if you want to say Brian was out because he had a cold and I shared that, that's fine. I shared that. It's no longer protected. But employers tend to go overboard. And as an employer, when you get to that point, don't go overboard. Keep your questions to the reason for the request in the first place. The reason for the request was, were you out for 3 days just because you blew off work? Right? You just didn't want to show to work and you're not reliable and therefore maybe I don't want you on my team, or were you under a doctor's care? Had you seen a doctor? And that's what it's there to prove, not to prove what kept you out of the workplace. Very quickly, I'd like to talk, close out the discussion on data privacy, really, which is really what this has been more about. Although we now understand that when you talk data, don't be thinking about data in terms of bits and bytes. Think about it in terms of paper. especially if you're a physical security, organizational security person. That's the data that you can protect, right? And you must protect. The California Privacy Rights Act really is, I would call it GDPR light. Started by the state of California. There was a previous law that was in effect. This one kind of just stepped it up even more. This is a very recent act. But what we are finding is that certain cities and certain other states are all considering very similar laws to this one, to the California Privacy Rights Act. And if you look at it, the types of things that are protected are very similar to GDPR. They're just Americanized, if you will. So government identifiers, your social security number, driver's license number, right? Financial account, login information, your geolocation, which is interesting, right? Where are you, right? Your race, ethnicity, religious or philosophical beliefs, union membership. Non-public communications, so mail, email, and text messages are protected under California Privacy Rights Act. And genetic data, right? Biometric data, health information, your things about your sexual orientation or sex life, all of that is protected. And by protected, it doesn't mean that it can't be discussed. It means that you have control over it. Okay, so let's talk about what the law actually allows you to do. So the California Privacy Rights Act, it applies to bigger businesses normally, not smaller ones. And in fact, this refreshment, if you will, of the law in 2020 actually made it a little less stringent on smaller businesses and much more stringent on larger businesses. And if you think in California, go to Silicon Valley, you've got all of the major players in data collection sit in that part of the country, really. So it really applied to those big data type companies, those big the FANGs, if you will, right? The Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google companies of the world, right? Alphabet, that collect big data. You have the right in California to correction, just as you have with GDPR. If the information is not correct, you can correct it. You can opt out of automatic decision making and profiling. So, for instance, I notice that I get ads for things when I'm home that are different than when I'm on the road. When I'm home, I am sure that companies using something called cookies, which you're all probably very familiar with, can tell where I am, my geolocation, right? They know where I am. And I get ads for certain things that I would not necessarily get when I'm somewhere else. I will share with you that when I'm home, I get ads for things like lawn service that pop up on my internet browser as I'm looking at other stuff, right? That's one of the ones that I get a lot of. Lawn service, home repair. I live in a zip code that has nicer homes compared to some other zip codes, and that people spend a fair amount on home improvement. And just about everybody has lawn service. I refuse to do that. When I get to the point where I can't cut my own grass, I'm going to go live someplace else because I'm stubborn like that. But in my neighborhood, probably 80% of the people have a lawn service. It's very competitive. In other parts of Grand Rapids, Michigan, there are neighborhoods where no one has lawn services. Just like any city, and it's a city of 250,000 people, there are areas where people's lawns just grow up over their fence line, and that's the way it is. But they know where I am, and therefore they profile me to say, okay, I have disposable income in order to use for a lawn service. I have the right in California, if I were there, to opt out of that automatic decision making, right? When I travel, I don't get those ads so much because I'm coming in from a different zip code, and I will get targeted ads from that zip code for a while. You have the right to understand that decision-making algorithm. Why am I getting these ads? You have the right to ask, why am I getting an ad from you? Well, you're getting it because you're signing in from this particular zip code, and we have used that zip code to look at people's income levels, to look at their usage on certain services, to look at their disposable income, to look at their credit histories, and therefore we're offering you things that we would not offer someone else. We've profiled you, right? And you have the right to understand those algorithms and then to limit the use and disclosure of that information. You can say, I don't want that information shared with anyone. And it's very hard to do because there are so many players in there. But the California law does give you the right to go to individuals who collect data and to tell them not to disclose your data to others so that you don't get those targeted types of ads. Or it may impact other things, right? Even the cost of those services. I will venture to say that if I call and say, I just got, your ad on my internet and it said I had a coupon code of 123ABC and I'd like to get that 20% off, I'm betting that I'm paying more than somebody else who isn't getting 20% off who has a different coupon code because I've been profiled as someone that could potentially afford more. So you have the right to limit and use to the use and disclosure of that information under this California law. I believe this California law will become the law of the land. I think that the issue is the administration of it. It takes a lot of time and effort to get your information, to understand who has it in the first place, and then to request that they don't have it. It's not easy, but there are some very big players in the data collection world that you could certainly go to and say, I choose not to have my information shared, and they must comply with that and must correct it if indeed it is wrong. So let's flip the coin and talk about that other part of privacy, the actual workplace privacy and expectation of privacy in the workplace. And this is one that trips up physical security managers, organizational security managers quite a bit. The best thing you can do is to have legal counsel in your hip pocket where you go and run these things by them first. But there are some general rules in the workplace, and I'll call them general rules because there are always exceptions. But there are certain expectations of privacy that employees think they have in the workplace that they really don't have. So things like desks and lockers, your office, if the company supplies that to someone, then there's no expectation of privacy in there. It is not illegal for a company to go into your locker, right? They assigned you that locker, but they own that locker and they can go in at any time. Now, there have been cases back and forth where the company tells you you must provide a lock yourself rather than provide one to you or have the lock that's built into the locker, and whether or not they need to get your permission to remove the lock, because there is some expectation of privacy if they allow you to put your own lock on, right? That's been a back and forth kind of court decision on those types of things, especially when you find really good stuff in a locker like weapons and drugs and that kind of stuff. But there's no expectation of privacy in your desk, in your work area, in your office, if the company has provided those things to you. The same thing is true of computers. Even when they ask you to bring your own device, which is a very common thing in many companies now, I prefer to use an Apple device, and if I wanted to, I could tell the company, you know what, I just want to use my own Apple computer for work. Can I do that? And they'd say, yes, you need to download a program where they have then control over certain things on your computer, and you've given them permission to do that just for your own convenience to use one computer rather than two. I use Apple for school and I use an IBM for work because I don't choose to give them access to my stuff. But there's no expectation of privacy on computers, and that includes things like email and internet history. Even if that email is personal in nature, if you're using the company email system to do it, brian.p.wisniewski@pfizer.com, when I send an email to my wife and say, I'll be home, late, that is company property. I'm using their email system to do it. The internet history, obviously, if I'm looking up stuff at work and somebody wants to go see what I'm looking up, absolutely. There is no expectation of privacy. And when you have employees who come and say, that's not fair, you can't read my email. I'm not reading your email. I'm reading my email because it is mine. I am the company. I'm the company representative, and you did it on my system. Now, text messages are kind of funny because the phone, who owns the phone, really becomes the issue. If you have a phone where the company pays your phone bill, but it's still a phone in your name, the company would not have a way to read your text messages. However, I have a company phone. When you guys call me on the weekend or whenever to ask questions, I answer on my company phone. It's the only phone that I have, and I'm allowed by my employer to use it for other purposes, to use it as a personal phone. However, when you text me, Pfizer Inc. can look at those text messages. I mean, we don't text anything that's really going to cause us any harm, but they are absolutely open to scrutiny by the company because they provide the phone. Now, phone calls are a little different, and it's very state dependent, but generally speaking, a company-provided telephone, desk telephone, can be monitored by the company for business purposes. If the company is monitoring the phone and that phone call is impersonal in nature, then it can't be listened to. Well, let's face it, how would you determine that? Well, you listen to a certain portion of it, and if it is personal in nature, then you shut down a recording device and you stop listening until that phone call is over. Yeah, okay. We all know that the government did that in RICO cases for years, that when the personal phone calls would go on between gangsters' families, that, once it was personal in nature, they had to shut off the recording and they had to take the headset off and wait for that phone call to be over. They could monitor it every so often to see if the tenor of the conversation changed. Yeah, okay. We all know how that works. I would not say that if you are using a company phone that I would assume that you have any right or expectation of privacy. But as a security manager, you can, I would certainly get permission and I would certainly get your lawyer to sign off, but going into somebody's desk that you've provided, their locker, their office, their computer, their email, their internet history, text messages on a company provided phone, absolutely open season in investigations. People don't understand that, but it is certainly been tested in the courts that when the company owns those things, there is no expectation of privacy unless it has been implied to the company and we say, your locker is, what you put in your locker is your business. We're not going to check it. If you don't say that, then the company does have the right to do that and there is no expectation of privacy. So what does that have to do with searches? Well, a big one. Person searches, right? They are very risky. But if they are related to the business, they are allowed. So, for instance, if I work in the counting room at a casino, certainly I expect that I will be searched on the way out every day. And in fact, most places that have that type of environment will have you wear garments that have no pockets on them, right? And you will be searched. You will change your clothes, and those clothes will be searched to make sure that you're not taking out any money. That is true in some places where controlled substances are produced, right? Controlled substances meaning certain drugs. If you're in a fentanyl factory, you know that you may be searched on the way out because it has a high black market value and it's very desirable on the black market. It's very risky. I would not suggest you do it unless you do it as a pattern. And by that, I mean, if you start to say, we're going to, search bags on the way out of our factory, we make, we make cell phones and we're going to search bags on the way out. You must search everyone. That includes executives. That includes visitors. It includes anybody who could have come in contact with that product that you believe might be pilfered, and that's normally the reason for a search. Or if it's contraband, bringing contraband in, right? You are concerned that people are bringing weapons into your facility. Then you check everybody for a weapon on the way in, right? Magnetometer probably being the best way to do that, but you could have other ways of checking parcels, lunchboxes, bags, those kinds of things. But you check everybody. Don't fall into a pattern of, I'm going to check this guy because I think he's up to something. That is where security managers get themselves into trouble. Now, when it comes to vehicles, if it's a company supplied or paid for vehicle, there's no expectation of privacy. People who drive company vehicles, even if that company vehicle can be used for personal purposes. So in large sales forces, if you have a large sales force for a product and they're spread all across the U.S., they probably have a company car that they use to go call on potential customers, and they're using it for personal purposes too. There's a tax law that says that they need to report the mileage they use for personal mileage versus business so that they pay income tax on the personal mileage. It's called imputed income for you people who are, accounting geeks. But if it's company provided vehicle, then the company could at any time show up and say, I want to look at the inside of that vehicle. Do you do it? Not necessarily, but you can. There's no expectation of privacy. Now, a private vehicle. So this is where security managers get jammed up. They think someone stole something from work, put it in their private vehicle in the parking lot. They caught him on camera taking it out there, and they got it. And they go to that person. They say, we want to search your car. The person says no. Your only recourse then is to fire them and ask them to drive away or to call the police. And if you have watched somebody on camera or you know that they took something out they shouldn't have, then call the police and allow them to get a warrant based on your evidence that shows that, that person did indeed steal something and follow through. I would never suggest that a security manager search a private vehicle without a direct permission from the person. If they say, yeah, absolutely, come on, let's go, and have them be there with you. But in most cases, if you have the need to search a private vehicle on your premises, you call the police and have them do it. Again, this is This is the some of the helpful hints so you don't jam yourself up section of the course, okay? And then finally, cameras. As long as cameras are not invasive, cameras in the workplace, there's no expectation of privacy. Cameras can be anywhere. Now, restrooms, locker rooms, that would be invasive, right? You're not going to put cameras in a restroom. Now, I have had places where we know that people, in fact, one particular case, people were going into a restroom. It had opening windows. It was an old factory, and the windows opening, ironically, was part of a union agreement. The windows had to be able to be opened, and people were constantly slitting the screens and throwing narcotics through the slits in the screens to their friends out on the street. That's what happens in Brooklyn, New York sometimes. Okay? We put cameras in the hallway to show who went in and who went out of the restroom. And then we put cameras on the street to show the narcotics being thrown through the slits in the screen. We didn't put it in the restroom to show that person absolutely did that, but normally people would only do it if they're the only one in the restroom. Nobody else is around. You set a time. You go into that restroom. You take the product off the line. You take it into the restroom with you. You throw it through the slit in the screen. Your brother-in-law on the street catches it, and you guys split the profits. We were able to put many cases together that way, so you don't necessarily need to have cameras in locker rooms and restrooms. If there's an area where it would be considered invasive, a lot of companies have nursing rooms and things like that. I mean, your occupational health area, the treatment rooms, those things, obviously off limits. But cameras are certainly allowed in the workplace as long as they're not invasive. So what can we do? What are the takeaways here? Well, you need to understand if you're collecting data, why you're collecting it. If you don't need it, if there's not a really valid reason why you need it and you need to retain it, then just don't collect it. You have to understand data that's PII, personally identifiable information, right? That whole concept of is this part of that Jenga, right? If I start stacking this data together, could and the rule that I usually use is, could I become this person online if I had all of this information? Could I just, convince somebody to give me a credit card or a loan or some other financial benefit by pretending to be somebody else if I had this amount of information? You have to understand with whom the data is shared. And is it shared across international boundaries? And if so, GDPR may kick in, and you want to be very careful. One of the concepts really when it comes to information is a single source of truth. If you collect a piece of information in your security systems, right, because you're the security manager and you're collecting data, why would I need to collect your date of birth? HR has that in another system. If I need your date of birth, I can call the HR person and say, hey, I need to know Brian's date of birth for whatever valid reason, right? If that data can be retrieved from some other source, don't collect it. That's really the rule of thumb. There's usually a single source of truth, and in the case of dates of birth, as an example, social security numbers, another example, those are held by HR and payroll. Payroll holds the social security number because they must report your earnings to the Social Security Administration. HR holds your date of birth because they were required to collect that information on your I-9 to show your immigration status when you were hired. I don't need to collect either piece of information and store it anywhere because a single source of truth is available to me. Don't be the holder if you don't need to be the holder. Have a data policy. When you collect, for every piece of data that you collect, have a why. Have a who can access it. Why do they need to access it? Have a policy on security data that you can share with your employees. If they want data, right? Data like a manager comes and says, hey, I want to know when Brian came and went last Thursday. Here's my policy. You need to go talk to HR, and we need a lawyer to sign off on this, that I'm going to give you this piece of data, right? Have a security policy. So your policy is, why am I collecting this data? Every piece of data you collect, have a why. And then have a who. Who is going to access this data, and why and are they the right person to access it? Right? If I do collect data for some reason on date of birth, because there's some reason I need to do that in my business, and security system may need to do that in a place that produces alcohol, right? I may need to have the date of birth of everybody to show that I've given them access to alcoholic beverages and they're over the age of 18. It's just an example. I don't know if it's true or not, but let's just say we need to do that. Does everybody need to have that? Does every security officer need to have access to that? Probably not. Probably the only one who would need access to it would be me, so I could show to a regulator that, I've given access based on date of birth. So have that policy. Allow for correction. If you keep data on somebody, with the exception really of investigative data, which, they'll always want to correct, but when you're taking normal data to operate your security department on the people who are in your facility, allow them to take a look at it and correct it. It's in your best interest. If there's something wrong in there, they're going to tell you it's wrong, and at least you'll know, right? And then really important is a retention schedule. How long are you going to keep data? And there's really a couple ways you can do that. There's a set time, right? I'm going to keep this record on who came and went using their access badge in and out of my facility for 7 years because I believe it to be an employment record, and that's how long we keep time cards, right? That could be one. Or you could just say for as long as reasonable business value is requires it. And if I don't need it, then I can get rid of it. And you should always be looking for ways to not store data. That's a huge thing. So in privacy laws, we know that we collect the minimum amount of data we need. We protect it very well. Data is not just on computers, but it is in paper. And as a physical security and organizational security manager, you are responsible for protecting that. You don't collect things you don't need. You don't hold on to it longer than you need to hold on to it. If people want data corrected, you do that. And in many cases, if they want to be forgotten, you must do that too or pay hefty fines. If you do those things, then you will not run afoul of privacy laws. You also need to keep abreast of privacy laws as they change frequently. So I went way long, and I apologize, but I know that in past courses where I've taught this subject, people wanted to know about both sides of the privacy, so I wanted to add that part about workplace expectations of privacy along with privacy laws. So this week, the lecture, you are done. Thank you for your attention, and I apologize for going long. There is some small amount of reading, and there's a really easy discussion this week, and it is due on Thursday, and responses to 2 classmates are due on Sunday. No late work will be accepted, as you know. The discussion is very easy this week. You will start to make a list of all of the people or all of the organizations or all the types of organizations that hold data on you, that hold personally protected, personally identifiable information on you. And I want you to be really critical and think about how many times, even in a week, you give out PII to people that you don't know, people or entities that you don't know. And it will really open your eyes to the amount of privacy data that you give up as an individual, and you're willingly doing that. And I really want to make everybody aware of it. So that's our discussion for this week, and you'll see the instructions in the discussion board. Your team leaders will be reaching out to you this week. I have assigned team leaders for our week 14 practice discussion, in which I will pose different workplace scenarios to you, and you will give me some legal cases, and that might influence how you handle that situation as a team. You've been broken into teams. Your team leaders have been assigned, and they will be reaching out to you if they haven't done that already. Please get back with them on times and dates that you are available during that week. You guys get to pick the times together, and I will be there no matter what time, day or night. But you need to do that quickly because I have this class and another one who are looking for times. I'm letting you guys go first because you're more upperclassmen in this. So I'm giving you that benefit, but next week I'll be doing the same with my CSS 210 class. So if you get your appointments in there, you don't have to compete with them as well. On Wednesday night, I will be on office hours for at least an hour. Office hours are 2 hours, as you know, on Wednesdays and 2 hours on Saturdays. Wednesday from 6 to 7, I'll be on Zoom. No pressure to show up, but if you do want to come by and say hello, or you have questions about the course, or you want to talk about anything, by all means, I will be there at least for that hour and be available for both hours by telephone if you want to talk to me. With that, have a great week. And again, I apologize for the long lecture, but I made up for it with an easy discussion this week. Have a great week.